Death. It's the final frontier of the human condition. An absolute, a hard biological boundary. The conclusion of our existence. But what happens when that boundary softens? What happens when the machinery of the human body refuses to stay dark? I'll tell you what happens. People start running. Welcome back to Chilled Bones. I'm Robert Ferrance, writer and raconteur of high strangeness. If you're new here, dim the lights, lock the doors, and do not go anywhere, because tonight we are going somewhere most people aren't willing to follow. Now, when you hear the word zombie, your brain immediately retreats to the comfortable, oversaturated safety of pop culture. The Walking Dead, where characters spend 11 seasons making the worst tactical decisions humanly possible. Resident Evil, or maybe your own corporate workplace on a Tuesday morning. We've commercialized the living dead. We've turned them into a multi-billion-dollar survival fantasy for suburban guys who own way too much tactical gear and secretly pray for a total societal collapse just so they don't have to pay their mortgages. But here's what I need you to understand before we go any further. The concept of the zombie didn't start with George Romero, and it doesn't end with a Hollywood headshot rule. And the further you follow me down into this rabbit hole tonight, the more the fiction starts to peel away like sunburned skin. Because past the mainstream movies and the schoolyard survival rules, we don't find a fun prepper paradise. We find cold, clinical, medical anomalies that mimic full cognitive shutdown in living human beings. We find the institutional horrors of psychological warfare used against civilian populations. We find historical realities of human anatomy being systematically and deliberately stripped away by governments that are still operating today. And at the very bottom of this iceberg, and I want you to stay with me until we get there, we find unclassified government contingency plans, philosophical paradoxes that will make you genuinely question the sentience of the people sitting right next to you, and the grim, documented reality of state-sponsored chemical lobotomies. We're going all the way down tonight, and I promise you, the bottom is worse than you can imagine. But before we begin our descent, if you're new to Chilled Bones, hit the like and subscribe. I drop horror and weird content every week, and you don't want to miss what's coming next. Also, if you like stories that keep you awake at night in the best way possible, check out my horror novels. I've written several of them. You can find out more about them at chilledbones.com. Links are right there below. Now, let's go find out what's waiting at the bottom of this terrifying iceberg. Tier 1, the surface. We start our descent at the top of the iceberg. The water up here is clear. The rules are familiar. The monsters wear their intentions on what's left of their sleeves. And the solutions are as simple as a well-placed blunt object. This is the version of the apocalypse we've been conditioned to handle since birth. It's comfortable. It's predictable. And when you actually sit down and analyze it for more than 10 seconds, you realize the entire foundation of this multi-billion-dollar global entertainment empire is built on absolute, unadulterated absurdity. Let's start with the bedrock of the modern myth. The dawn of the slow walker. 1968. Young filmmaker named George Romero unleashes Night of the Living Dead on an unsuspecting public. He doesn't even call them zombies, he calls them ghouls. But in doing so, he accidentally drafts the permanent definitive blueprint for civilizational collapse. The image is iconic. A pale, disheveled figure, a cemetery, a stiff, uncoordinated gait. But strip away the nostalgia. Look at those early black and white frames with a cold, analytical eye. And you run face first into one of the most embarrassing realities in the history of human fiction. The classic Romero zombie does not run, doesn't leap across rooftops, doesn't climb fences with predatory grace. Its maximum recorded velocity is a casual, unhurried mall walk. It shambles. It wanders aimlessly, trips over low-lying lawn furniture, and gets tangled up in simple rose bushes. It possesses the spatial awareness of a profoundly intoxicated toddler and the physical urgency of someone trying to stretch out a 15-minute break at an office job. So here's the uncomfortable question that no one in Hollywood wants you to ask. If a global civilization, a society equipped with supersonic fighter jets, satellite-guided artillery, thermal imaging, automated heavy weaponry, and billions of coordinated human minds, collapses because it can't outmaneuver an apex predator moving at a brisk 1.5 miles per hour, well, that civilization was already looking for an excuse to quit. The slow walker is an evolutionary joke. It gives its prey several business days' notice before mounting an attack. And yet, in every surface-tier narrative, this pathetic, stumbling entity somehow overthrows the United States military. How, you might ask? Because the true superpower of the slow zombie has nothing to do with its physical capability. Its true superpower is that every human being trapped inside a horror movie is legally, contractually forbidden from possessing basic situational awareness. The plot requires humanity to collectively forget how to run in a straight line, how to lock a back door, or how to check the back seat of a car before putting the keys in the ignition. We're asked to believe that the pinnacle of human military engineering is completely useless against a crowd of rotting corpses that could be contained by a moderately sturdy chain link fence or a flight of stairs with a missing step. It's a beautifully fragile fiction, and we love it anyway. But audiences eventually grew complacent. The slow walker stopped being an existential threat and became a background nuisance, the cinematic equivalent of a bad traffic jam. The monster needed an upgrade. Enter 2002, the cultural shockwave that changed everything. The 28 Days Later Revolution. With one frantic cinematic stroke, Danny Boyle traded slow-burning dread for raw cardiovascular anxiety. The rage virus didn't reanimate corpses. It hijacked living, breathing nervous systems with a hyper-virulent strain of weaponized rage. Suddenly, the comfortable mall walk was over. These creatures didn't want to slowly corner you in an abandoned farmhouse. They wanted to close the distance between themselves and your uninfected body at an Olympic sprint. They didn't feel pain. They didn't accumulate lactic acid. They threw themselves through plate glass windows and off balconies without hesitation. The rules changed overnight. So did the metaphor. The slow walker was a metaphor for the inevitable, the creeping approach of death that catches up to us all eventually, no matter how fast we run. The sprinting infected was something entirely different. It was a panic attack given physical form. Pure modern chaos with zero warning and zero time to think. The zombie apocalypse stopped being a test of survival strategy. It became a brutal, unforgiving test of personal cardio. If you couldn't run a 5-minute mile while carrying a backpack, your role in the New World Order became a lower tier on the food chain, my friend. But whether they shamble or sprint, every zombie in fictional universes bows to the same single, non-negotiable law: the headshot rule. Stop and think about the biological absurdity of this for just one moment. We're presented with a creature that is, by every visible metric, completely biologically non-functional. Its lungs don't work, its heart isn't pumping, its veins are filled with coagulated black sludge, its internal organs have liquefied, and its flesh is actively separating from the bone. And yet, despite the total absence of metabolic fuel, cellular respiration, or circulatory support, this rotting, chemically compromised nervous system somehow coordinates complex motor functions. It navigates terrain, maintains balance, it exerts jaw pressure to bite through leather and human bone, all while operating in complete defiance of the laws of thermodynamics. But the moment a 9mm bullet grazes the frontal lobe, total system failure. Drops like a sack of wet flour. If the brain can function without blood, without oxygen, without glucose, while actively decomposing in summer heat, why does a small mechanical hole suddenly matter so much? It doesn't. Nature doesn't work that way. Real pathogens don't care about localized structural damage. But on the surface tier, we don't ask these questions. We just reload and aim for the teeth. So that brings us to the final stop on the surface layer. The place where the fiction of the undead crossed over into our actual reality became something far more revealing than any horror movie. The prepper fantasy. Somewhere in the last 2 decades, the zombie apocalypse stopped being a catastrophe anyone wanted to avoid. It became a lifestyle brand. Walk into any outdoor sporting goods store today. You'll find zombie-rated machetes in neon green, tactical backpacks with hydration bladder compartments, custom-engraved firearm components, and pallets of freeze-dried MREs designed to survive 20-year nuclear winters. The zombie apocalypse became the unthinkable societal collapse, escapist fantasy for the over-domesticated suburban citizen. And here's the uncomfortable truth underneath that fantasy. A staggering number of people secretly, deeply want societal collapse. Not because they're evil, not because they want their families to suffer, but because they are completely, utterly exhausted by the grinding machinery of modern life. The endless commute, the soul-crushing performance review, the rising interest rates, the 30-year mortgage they will never fully pay off, the passive-aggressive email from Karen in accounting that requires a response within the hour. Hi, Bill. We really need you to turn in your TPS report. The zombie apocalypse offers a seductive alternative. The moment the dead rise, your credit card debt evaporates. Your student loans don't exist. Your micromanaging boss is currently being eaten alive in the break room, which you're happy about. And you will never have to reply to another passive-aggressive email for as long as you live. Life becomes beautifully, brutally simple. Survive until sunset. That's the whole job description. That's all you got to do from now on. The prepper fantasy allows someone to stop being an insignificant cog in a corporate spreadsheet and start being a rugged, self-reliant protagonist, standing on a rooftop, silhouetted against the dramatic sunset, holding a weapon, finally feeling like the hero of their own story. I get it. I genuinely do. Some days Karen's emails make the zombie apocalypse sound like a reasonable alternative. But here's where the fantasy breaks down. As we leave the surface behind, the sunlight fades and the pressure builds. The comfortable fiction starts to rot because nature doesn't operate on movie logic. Real biological vectors don't care about your neon green machete or your weekend survival training. True biological horror doesn't wait for a clean headshot. It doesn't give you a fresh start. It strips your humanity away with a cold, clinical indifference that makes every Hollywood zombie look like a bedtime story. The water is getting much darker now. I hope you're ready for what comes next. Tier 2, The Shallows. The Hollywood fiction is gone now. The water is colder down here. The pressure is building. And the rules have changed completely. We are no longer talking about movie tropes, cinematic pacing, or convenient headshot mechanics. Down here in the shallows, we enter the domain of clinical biology, speculative science, and real-world pathology. This is where the zombie stops being a monster designed by a makeup artist and starts becoming something that actually exists. Let's start off with the organism that should terrify you more than anything Hollywood has ever produced. Now I'm going to try to pronounce this, so bear with me. Ophiocordyceps Ophiocordyceps unilateralis. Ophiocordyceps unilateralis. That's probably way wrong, and if you're a science geek out there, I don't care. That's how I'm going to say it. If you've played The Last of Us video game or watched the series, you already know the dramatized version of this fungus. But the real-world reality is far more disturbing than any game engine can render. And there's one specific detail, one single biological fact that every adaptation leaves out because it's simply too horrifying to even put on screen. Here's what they don't tell you. In the tropical rainforests of the world, when a spore of, I'm going to try it again, Ophiocordyceps, whatever, lands on an ant, doesn't attack the brain. It leaves the brain completely, entirely untouched. Let that sit for a second. Instead of mangling the brain like any other good zombie-inducing entity, this fungus weaves a dense microscopic network of tubes throughout the ant's muscle tissue. It physically severs the lines of communication between the brain and the body. It doesn't need to take over the mind, so it just cuts the wires. The ant's brain remains fully functional, fully aware, a conscious, helpless passenger trapped inside its own body while an alien organism manually puppets its limbs from within the muscle tissue itself. So think about what that means. The ant knows exactly what's happening to it. It watches itself stand up and walk away from its colony. It watches itself climb a plant stem to a height of exactly 25 centimeters above the forest floor. The precise altitude where humidity and temperature are biologically perfect for a fungal growth. It watches itself clamp its jaws onto the underside of a leaf on a death grip it can't release. Then it watches itself die. The fungus digests the ant's internal organs, then grows a spore-bearing stalk directly out of the back of the ant's skull to rain down an infection on the colony below. Flawless, cold, mathematical, happening right under the leaf litter of the real world. And before anyone in the comments reassures themselves that, well, it only targets ants. Yeah, for now. Evolution is a process, not a destination. It hasn't stopped, and it's never going to stop. That thing is out there, and that thing is mutating. It's not going to stop at ants. Why would it? There are much bigger creatures out there in the world. You, for instance. So sleep well. Now, When science fiction tries to explain a rage-based zombie outbreak, it almost always reaches for the same explanation: rabies, or a mutated strain of rabies. On paper, it makes perfect sense. Rabies is a real laceravirus that hijacks the central nervous system, causes extreme aggression, hydrophobia, acute pain, and an uncontrollable urge to bite living creatures to spread the infection. It is, for all practical purposes, the closest thing to a real zombie virus that nature has already built. So the logic goes: tweak the incubation period from weeks down to seconds, and you get an instant apocalypse. Except biology doesn't cooperate with that premise, and here's exactly why. If a virus mutates to make its host hyper-aggressive, frantic, and constantly sprinting at full capacity, that virus has just committed evolutionary suicide. A host burning at that extreme level of physical output, without a functioning digestive system, without hydration, without metabolic regulation, collapses within 48 to 72 hours. Total muscle failure. Catastrophic organ shutdown. The host burns out before the infection can spread far enough to even matter. But there's a second problem that's even more damaging. Nature heavily disfavors loud, explosive pathogens. If a virus turns its host into a screaming, visible lunatic, the surrounding population immediately identifies the threat and contains it. Evolution prefers quiet, subtle, insidious. Things that spread silently through the air or through asymptomatic carriers over months or even years. A virus that announces its presence by making someone try to chew your face off is a catastrophically bad evolutionary strategy. It burns too bright, too fast, and it fizzles out long before it achieves anything close to a global takeover. So if you want a real biological agent that genuinely mimics the cognitive collapse of a zombie, one that's patient, silent, unstoppable, and 100% real, you have to go somewhere much darker than a virus. Prion diseases. A prion is not alive. It's not a virus, not a bacterium, not a fungus. It has no DNA, no RNA, no cellular structure of any kind. A prion is a piece of protein, a normal everyday protein found in your brain that has become misfolded, twisted into a subtly wrong shape. And the single most terrifying property of a prion is this: the moment a misfolded prion touches a healthy protein, it forces that protein to misfold in the same abnormal shape. A silent, invisible, microscopic chain reaction of structural decay spreading through your brain, one protein at a time. We see this in Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, in mad cow disease, in Kuru, a condition discovered in Papua New Guinea linked directly to ritualistic cannibalism. And the clinical progression of a prion disease looks exactly like a slow-motion zombie transition. The patient loses motor coordination first. They develop a stiff, shuffling gait. Their speech deteriorates into unintelligible sounds. Cognitive function collapses. Behavior becomes erratic and sometimes violently unpredictable. Basic human empathy disappears, and self-awareness goes dark. The person you knew is still in there somewhere, but something has taken over control. And here's the detail that should genuinely disturb you. Prions cannot be killed by boiling water. They cannot be destroyed by alcohol, radiation, or standard medical sterilization. They can lie dormant in soil or on a surgical instrument for decades, waiting, entirely invisible, for someone to come along and accidentally ingest them. No cure, no treatment, 100% mortality rate. This is the closest thing to a real zombie pathogen that the laws of physics allow to exist. And it's already out there. So there's that. But biological horror doesn't stay confined to medical textbooks. Sometimes it escapes into the internet. And what happens next reveals something deeply uncomfortable about all of us. Let's talk about the necromorphosis hoax. In the early 2000s, as internet forum culture was finding its footing, a series of extraordinarily detailed clinical-sounding documents began circulating in the darker corners of the web. They claimed to be leaked classified CDC reports regarding a newly discovered pathogen designated necromorphosis. The hoax was brilliantly engineered. It didn't use the language of a horror movie. It used cold, sterile, bureaucratic medical jargon. Described a virus causing cellular necrosis while simultaneously stimulating the brainstem to maintain both basic motor function, producing symptoms of profound catatonia, violent aggression, and apparent post-mortem reanimation. It came with fake autopsy photos, statistical infection charts, official-looking government warning templates, and it spread across the internet like a wildfire. Local news stations in multiple major American cities ran actual panicked segments asking whether the government was concealing a bizarre new neurological disease from the public. And that reaction reveals something that matters far more than the hoax itself. If you wrap a ridiculous, biologically impossible monster in the sterile, authoritative language of institutional medicine, the public will believe it. Every time. We're so deeply dependent on and secretly terrified of the medical establishment that a well-crafted paragraph of clinical jargon can convince us, even if only for 48 hours, that the dead are beginning to walk. Monster doesn't have to be real. It just has to sound like it came from someone in a lab coat. That's the vulnerability. And we are never going to fully outgrow it. Now, we've looked at the science, we've examined the speculation, and we watched the internet convince itself the apocalypse was leaking out of a CDC server somewhere. But all of that, the fungal parasites, the rabies paradoxes, the prion diseases, the digital hoaxes, all of it is just a modern framework. A set of comfortable, rational explanations we use to process a fear that is far, far older than any laboratory. To find the true origin of the zombie, we have to leave the science behind entirely. We have to go to a place where the horror isn't theoretical anymore. So let's head into Tier 3, where the history is real, where the documentation exists, and where what you're about to hear is significantly worse than anything we've covered so far. Tier 3, the dark zone. We have now crossed a major threshold. As we drop into the absolute darkness of Tier 3, we leave the laboratories, the internet hoaxes, and the scientific hypotheticals completely behind. The speculative fiction ends here. Down in the dark zone, we are forced to look directly at the actual historical roots of the word zombie. And what we find isn't a fun sci-fi monster or a biological curiosity. We find a deeply unsettling archive of human cruelty, cultural trauma, and psychological violations of autonomy so profound that they make Hollywood's flesh-eating ghouls look remarkably gentle. Let's begin with the true historical epicenter of the myth, the Haitian Vodou origins and Clervius narcissae. In the Western world, we have completely commercialized and sanitized the zombie. But in the rich history of Haitian Vodou, a zombie was never a monster that wanted to eat your brains. It was something far more terrifying. It was a victim. The word itself traces back to West African spiritual concepts, but it mutated in Haiti into a very real institutional horror story about social execution. 1980, a man named Clervius Narcissae walked into a village in Haiti 18 years after his own family had watched him die, signed his death certificate, and buried him in a local cemetery. His return sparked an international scientific investigation. Narcisse's story exposed the grim reality of zombification, a practice used by secret, powerful socio-political societies in rural Haiti to punish individuals who had violated community laws. The process didn't rely on magic. It relied on a terrifying mastery of natural chemistry. A specialized sorcerer known as a bokor would administer a powder containing tetrodotoxin, a lethal neurotoxin harvested from pufferfish. In the precise dosage, tetrodotoxin doesn't kill. It induces a state of profound paralysis that mimics clinical death so perfectly that even trained physicians cannot detect a pulse or respiration. The true horror of this experience is existential agony. The victim remains fully conscious, completely aware, trapped inside a paralyzed corpse. Clervius Narcissae described the absolute nightmare of lying perfectly still while his sister wept over his body, while the sheet was pulled over his face, and while he was lowered into a suffocating, pitch-black coffin underground. A few days after the burial, the bokor would exhume the body. The victim was dug up, beaten, and immediately fed a paste made from Datura stamonium, commonly known as the zombie cucumber or Jimson weed. Datura is a powerful hallucinogen that completely obliterates short-term memory, induces permanent disorientation, and strips away a human being's willpower. Narcisse was stripped of his name, his identity, and his memories, and forced to work as a mindless, chemically enslaved laborer on a remote sugar plantation for nearly 2 decades. This is the true original zombie, a living human being systematically stripped of their mind, their free will, and their identity, and then forced to exist as a biological machine. To understand why this specific nightmare took root so deeply in the soil of Haiti, we have to look even further back into history, to a brutal legal framework known as the Code Noir. Decreed by King Louis XIV of France in 1685, the Code Noir, or Black Code, was the official legal document that regulated the conditions of slavery in the French colonial empire, specifically in Saint-Dominique, the colony that would later become Haiti. The French sugar plantations of Saint-Dominique were notorious for being the most brutal, unforgiving, and lethal labor camps on the planet. The enslaved population was systematically worked to death, with starvation, extreme violence, and industrial torture used as everyday tools of management. Within this waking nightmare, the original zombie myth was born. For the enslaved people of Saint-Dominique, death was not something to be feared. Death was the ultimate release. It was the only escape mechanism they had left, a spiritual doorway that would finally allow their souls to cross the Atlantic and return to Languigny, the mythological African homeland of freedom and ancestors. But the Bokors and colonial overseers twisted this spiritual comfort into the ultimate psychological weapon. The myth arose that if an enslaved person committed suicide to escape their labor, they would be denied entry into their ancestral homeland. Instead, as a punishment for taking their own life, their soul would be intercepted at the grave. They would be reanimated as a corpse, denied a mind, and cursed to work the sugarcane fields of Saint Dominique for all of eternity, even after death. The cynical depth of this cultural trauma is staggering. In the original historical context, the ultimate dread wasn't the fear of being chased or eaten by a zombie. The ultimate terror was the fear of becoming a zombie. It was the psychological manifestation of a trauma so deep that even the grave offered no guarantee of freedom. It was a myth designed to enforce compliance by threatening that the ultimate machinery of human exploitation would survive physical death of the body. But you don't have to travel back to the 18th century sugar plantations to find instances of a human mind being entirely disconnected from its own biological reality. Sometimes the human brain fractures all on its own, descending into a terrifying psychological anomaly known as Cotard's Delusion. First identified by the French neurologist Jules Cotard in 1880, this rare psychiatric syndrome is also known, with chilling accuracy, as walking corpse syndrome. It's a profound, unshakable delusion where a living, breathing patient sincerely, deeply believes they're dead. Patients suffering from Cotard's don't just feel depressed or disconnected. Their entire perception of reality undergoes a catastrophic inversion. They will look a medical professional in the eye and calmly explain that they no longer possess a heart, that their internal organs have completely putrefied into black sludge, or that their skin is actively rotting away. In severe cases, patients will claim that they can smell their own decomposing flesh, or that they will completely abandon self-care, refusing to eat or bathe because they believe it's a biological absurdity to feed a corpse. Neurologists believe that Cotard's is caused by a structural disconnect between the fusiform face area, the part of the brain that recognizes faces, and the amygdala, which attaches emotional significance to those memories. When a patient looks in the mirror, they recognize their own face, but they feel absolutely zero emotional resonance. The brain, struggling to resolve this profound internal paradox, reaches a terrifying logical conclusion. If I feel absolutely nothing, I must no longer exist. It's the ultimate clinical horror of the human mind fracturing against its own biology. A true living zombie trapped in a prison of its own broken neurology. And finally, at the deep floor of the dark zone, we find the medical anomaly that historical societies used to justify their deepest, most primal fears of the graveyard, the Lazarus phenomenon. Long before the invention of modern electrocardiograms, digital pulse monitors, and sophisticated resuscitation equipment, determining the exact moment of a human death was a remarkably unscientific guessing game. If a patient's breathing was too shallow to see, or their skin grew cold, and if their pulse was too faint for a rural doctor to detect, they were pronounced dead. The Lazarus phenomenon, named after the biblical figure raised from the dead by Jesus, is a real, documented medical occurrence where a patient's circulatory system spontaneously restarts after all attempts at CPR have been entirely abandoned and the patient has been legally pronounced dead. The heart simply decides, outside of all medical explanation, to resume its rhythm minutes or even hours after the flatline. In the 18th and 19th centuries, before embalming became a standard commercial practice, this rare physiological anomaly fueled an absolute epidemic of tapophobia, the primal fear of premature burial. It is estimated that hundreds, perhaps thousands, of individuals across history were placed into wooden boxes and lowered into the earth while merely suffering from profound comas, catalepsy, or the Lazarus phenomenon. The true horror here isn't the ghost story of a corpse rising from the grave. It's the reality of what happened when those people woke up 6 feet beneath the soil. It's the historic evidence found during cemetery relocations. Coffins opened to reveal scratch marks on the insides of the lids, broken fingernails, and skeletons twisted into positions of full claustrophobic panic. The historical fear of the dead returning was never about a supernatural curse. It was a deeply suppressed collective guilt. Deep down, humanity knew that our medical limitations meant we were occasionally burying people alive. And the monsters we imagined scratching at the cemetery gates were just the horrific echoes of our own mistakes. But as we leave the historical realities and psychological fractures of the dark zone behind, the water goes completely black. Because when you drop down into the final, absolute bottom of this iceberg, you don't find individual victims, historical trauma, or broken minds. You find the cold, sterile, calculating machinery of systems that operate completely outside of human morality. So let's plunge into the absolute abyss of Tier 4. Tier 4, the abyss. We have finally reached the absolute bottom. Light from the surface is gone, the pressure is immense, and the human element has completely dissolved into the dark. Down here in the abyss, we are no longer dealing with abstract philosophy or cinematic metaphors. We have entered the cold, sterile world of institutional calculation and raw, chaotic, street-level terror. This is the layer where human behavior fractures so violently under the influence of synthetic chemistry and weaponized policy that the boundary between human and monster is gone. Let's begin with the cold, bureaucratic reality of military logistics. CONPLAN 8888. If you look into the unclassified archives of the United States Strategic Command, you will find a very real, remarkably thorough document officially titled Counter-Zombie Dominance. This isn't an internet hoax, and it isn't a leaked science fiction screenplay. It's a genuine, comprehensive military contingency plan designed by corporate Pentagon planners. The defense establishment often defends CONPLAN 8888 as a highly creative training exercise, a fictional scenario used to teach young officers how to draft complex, large-scale survival strategies against an unconventional threat without accidentally offending foreign governments by simulating an invasion of a real country. But when you read the actual text of the document, the satirical shield falls away, exposing the terrifyingly clinical mind of the military-industrial complex. The script of CONPLAN 8888 details tactical protocols for handling several distinct classes of undead entities, ranging from pathogenic zombies to occult zombies, and even vegetarian zombies. But the true chilling horror of the document itself isn't the monsters. It's the language. The Pentagon writes about the total liquidation of civilian populations with a sterile, completely detached bureaucratic efficiency. It outlines force protection measures, envirochemical decontamination, and the systematic implementation of martial law using phrases like the total eradication of non-human entities. CONPLAN 8888 proves that if an apocalyptic collapse ever actually happens, the institutional response won't look like a heroic Hollywood movie. It will be a cold, mathematical calculation. The government has already pre-written the sterile legal paperwork required to classify infected citizens as non-human property, allowing the machinery of the state to handle human beings with the exact same industrial indifference as hazardous waste or a broken piece of equipment. But the cold paperwork of the government becomes an active, terrifying reality when the synthetic chemistry hits the pavement. This brings us to the Miami Causeway attack. On Memorial Day weekend in 2012, the entire world was forced to stare directly into a real-world zombie nightmare. On the MacArthur Causeway in Miami, Florida, police responded to a scene that looked like a literal frame out of an apocalyptic horror film. A man named Rudy Eugene had stripped entirely naked, cornered a homeless man named Ronald Papeau on the sidewalk, and proceeded to launch into a feral, hyperviolent attack, actively chewing off the majority of the man's face. When a police officer arrived and ordered Eugene to stop, the attacker didn't run. He didn't cower. He didn't surrender. Instead, he turned his head, growled at the officer with pieces of flesh in his mouth, and advanced. It took multiple gunshots to finally neutralize him. In the immediate panicked media firestorm that followed, the public and law enforcement blamed the attack on a new wave of synthetic design drugs commonly known as bath salts. While subsequent toxicology reports only officially confirmed the presence of marijuana in Eugene's system, the incident permanently fused the concept of synthetic drug psychosis with the archetype of the flesh-eating zombie in the modern cultural consciousness. It proved that under the right conditions of neurological fracturing, a human being could completely shed every single shred of human consciousness, societal conditioning, and basic empathy, reverting into a biting, growling, unstoppable predator that feels zero pain and recognizes no authority. This terrifying psychological break induces us to the broader clinical reality of synthetic cathinone psychosis. While the specific Miami attacker's toxicology remains a point of medical debate, the bath salts epidemic in the early 2010s and the subsequent rise of hyperpotent synthetic stimulants like Flakka revealed the dark corner of illicit chemistry that acts as a functional zombie serum. These drugs are synthetic cathinones, designed to flood the human brain with an absolute catastrophic tidal wave of dopamine and norepinephrine. The clinical progression of a high-dose synthetic cathinone overdose reads exactly like a checklist for an undead outbreak. It induces a medical state known as excited delirium. The patient's body temperature skyrockets to dangerous levels, often exceeding 105 degrees, causing a profound instinctual reaction to strip naked in a desperate attempt to cool down. More terrifyingly, the drug completely rewires the brain's survival centers. The user falls into a state of absolute paranoid psychosis, experiencing a vivid, horrifying hallucination that convinces them that they're being hunted by demons or monsters. This triggers an explosion of superhuman strength, fueled by adrenaline and a total neurological disconnection from pain. When a person is in the grip of excited delirium, their muscles operate at maximum mechanical capacity without the brain's natural power to govern or stop them. They will smash through glass, absorb blunt force trauma, and fight through tasers and police restraints with a mindless, relentless momentum. They become entirely nonverbal, communicating only through guttural grunts, screams, and animalistic snaps of the jaw. It's a state of pure chemical animality, a living human body operating entirely on the raw instinct to destroy what's ever in its field of vision. And finally, at the absolute bedrock of the abyss, we look past the explosive violence of stimulants and witness the quiet, grinding devastation of the Zalazine riot. In recent years, the illicit drug supply across major urban centers has undergone a grim institutional shift with the introduction of Zalazine, commonly known on the street as Trank. Zalazine is a powerful veterinary sedative and analgesic, completely unapproved for human use, that is increasingly used as a cutting agent in synthetic opioids. The visual and physical toll of this drug on a population creates a landscape that is indistinguishable from a post-apocalyptic quarantine zone. Because Zalazine isn't the severe vasoconstrictor, it severely restricts blood flow to the skin and extremity tissues. The result is the development of horrific necrotic skin ulcers and open wounds that actively rot while the user is still alive. The tissue dies, blackens, and peels away, leaving deep infections that frequently lead to amputation. Furthermore, the immediate behavioral effect of the drug strips away the last remnants of human posture and coordination. Walk down the street of Kensington and Philadelphia, or similar hard-hit districts, and you will see dozens of individuals trapped in what is known as the Trank lean. They are completely bent over at the waist, arms hanging limply toward the pavement, frozen in a state of semi-conscious animation for hours at a time. They wander blindly through traffic with a slow, uncoordinated, shuffling gait, completely unresponsive to the world around them, their bodies physically decaying in real time. Conclusion. So, what have we learned today as we dragged ourselves out of the dark, murky depths of this particular iceberg? Well, for starters, we've learned that if the apocalypse actually goes down Hollywood style, you don't need a compound or a mountain of freeze-dried beef stroganoff. You just need a moderately sturdy chain-link fence and a flight of stairs with a missing step to defeat a slow walker. We learned that real nature is terrifyingly polite enough to leave an ant's brain completely intact while manually pulling its muscle strings like a fleshy marionette. We traced the grim, heartbreaking history of where this entire myth actually began in the sugar fields of Haiti. And finally, we realized that the government already has the sterile paperwork ready to classify us as biohazardous material, while synthetic street chemistry is actively turning urban centers into literal walking quarantine zones. Turns out we don't need a rogue meteor, a cursed ancient burial ground, or a top-secret bioweapon to bring the monsters to life. We've been perfectly capable of manufacturing our own living nightmares all along. Whether through historic cruelty, synthetic designer drugs, or just the existential dread of a 30-year corporate mortgage. Before you double-check the locks on your front door and try to scrape your brain back together, please hit that like and subscribe button if you're interested in the macabre and high strangeness. I'll be posting more horror-related content right here each and every week. Also, if you love reading chilling stories that creep into your head and keep you awake long after the lights go out, I'd like to invite you to check out some of my horror novels. I've written several of them, and they dive into some incredibly dark places. You can find out more about my books and my original fiction and explore plenty of other strange things by heading over to chilledbones.com. I'm Robert Ference, and this is Chilled Bones. Thank you for descending into the abyss with me tonight. Sleep well, if you can.